lecture um popped into the perusal. I actually didn't realize when it popped in, but I did watch it on Canvas, and I just wanted to verify that I got attendance credit for it, etc.
Okay.
Do you want me to email you or direct message you on Canvas? Which,
y- yeah.
okay, what's your preferred method?
Per preferred if you would email me. Um,
Okay,
so from now on, these video lectures will be posted through perusal, like as an assignment for people
perfect. Yeah.
that don't attend.
Okay.
I'm just I'm new to all this stuff, and so
Yeah,
I didn't know how to do it, and so
for
now
sure.
somebody taught me. So
I'm figuring it out with you. So yeah.
yeah,
Okay, cool. Thank you.
I'm
I'll
glad.
email you just to double check and verify. Thank you.
Okay. We'll get started in here in just a minute. I'm just taking down the names of people who are here so that I have you for your attendance. Uh, Thank you all to who are here. As I say every or have said every class, it's very helpful to me to have people here in person if you can make it, or not in person, but at the same time. It helps, I think, with class engagement, and especially thanks to Fernando for having your video on. It helps remind me that I'm not just talking into my computer like a crazy person.
Hopefully
uh,
the Pokemon in the background aren't too distracting.
no, that's fine. I'm too old to recognize a Pokemon when I see it. So I couldn't tell you what that is. So don't worry about it. Um, we'll get started here. Um, I'm gonna do a couple things today. Let me go to screen share mode now. Um, it looked like everybody got the vast majority of you got full credit for your perusal assignment, your first kind of perusal reading assignment. And so I'm glad to see that it seems to be is clear in terms of the instructions and what to do. There were several very good, robust discussions that went on around the reading, which I'd like to sort of like review a little bit today, before we go on to considering Karl Marx. So we're definitely going to get started with Marx today. I'm real excited to teach Marx to you over like the next 3 weeks or so. Um, and again, with this kind of method of like a close reading of the texts. So this week you have, as far as your assignments, you have the similar kind of thing as you had last week with looking at the core ideas of Marx as they're summarized in the text, and kind of introduced. And then the first reading that we really grapple with is called The German Ideology, written by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels in 1845 and 1846. The German ideology we will probably tackle on Monday through a close reading that some of you have dubbed like a Bible study kind of method. Um, in the interim, also this week, I want you to be watching this documentary. It's a little less than an hour. on Karl Marx that was done by the BBC. So this is going to be a video that the way that I had put it starting in the first week was to kind of like it's like a palate cleanse for thinking about Marx, because a lot of times people have a lot of baggage in what they think about Marx that has been passed down over time. And I find that a lot of times students come in with a kind of a preconceived notions about Marx that I'm eager to dispel before we can kind of move on to considering what the man really had to say, as opposed to what other people, either for or against him, have, the words that they've put in his mouth. So this documentary is basically going to kind of try to argue about how his ideas are still relevant for today, especially for understanding capitalism and our capitalist society of the present. And so you'll have to watch this documentary, and then there is a exercise here under module, the second week module. This is your second exercise. That is just kind of a short thing. It doesn't require anything other than that you've watched the film. And it's just going to kind of ask you about what you think about his critique of capitalism. And so, like, which events or examples discussed in the film would seem to indicate that his critique is still useful for today. And it says, as it says here, Marx is a highly controversial and frequently misunderstood figure. I would say he's probably possibly the most controversial thinker in the history of the world. To this day, he continues to elicit a lot of controversy, and he's, as a result, frequently misunderstood, both by some of his enthusiasts and by his detractors. And so it just asks you like what you find interesting or surprising. And hopefully this will be a kind of an introductory conversation that we can have as a class. So I'm going to want you to, post your reply, roughly in 200 to 250 words, and then reply to two other students in the class, as you did with your introductory assignment, which also seems to have gone off very smoothly, with minimal misunderstanding. So that's what you've got on tap for this week. And like I said, the instructions for the reading assignment are pretty much what they were for the last one. Any questions or comments or confusions from those of you who are attendant today?
I actually do have a question, Professor.
Sure.
Will we be quizzed on any of these topics?
Yeah, so there is, if you notice in the syllabus, there are, I think I've listed 3 quizzes. One on Marx, one on Weber, one on Durkheim. And they kind of come at the end of the module. So I think that the first one is scheduled more for like late September, And to repeat what I said, and as it also says about in the syllabus, these are not like pop quizzes. They're more like take-home tests or open book tests, in the sense that you have a week to complete them. So you can kind of open up the Canvas quiz a week before it's due, and kind of look into the questions, which will mostly be like true, false, and multiple choice type questions. And then you can kind of dig into the material to answer them. And many of the questions I think will be, at that point, we'll have been talking about Marx for like, 3 weeks. And so I think a lot of the questions you may even be able to answer without, digging into the material because you've like already learned it. So that'll be coming, and I'll be sure to talk about that, especially before the first quiz. I'll be sure to talk about that in these synchronous sessions. Did that answer your question, Fernando? Okay,
Yeah, sorry, my computer's acting funny.
no worries.
Thank you, appreciate it.
Okay. Okay. Anything else from anybody? Okay. I was pretty happy with the discussion that we had here around classical social theory and our introductory reading from the authors. So let's take a look at this. There are a few discussions that I wanted to kind of highlight in this, and then we'll jump into Marx. I only, want to spend maybe like 20 minutes or so kind of reviewing, what we have looked at in this previous the assignment that's due today, just as a way of kind of, putting a nice bow on our exercises here. It seems that a lot of you, this was helpful. This initial story that I hadn't thought to really kind of go over. But I especially this idea that like in our everyday life, how does it say here? Facts aren't enough by themselves. That's I think the point of this opening story from Alice in Wonderland. That in order to, we need just not facts. We need a way of interpreting and understanding those facts, a way of kind of putting them together. And that's what theory does. It gives us a way of piecing together these facts into, like a puzzle, you know. And so in that sense, like we all as human beings, we all theorize. In fact, we have to theorize. We have to have a theory. Sometimes I would say quite often they're the wrong theories. People walk around with all kinds of crazy like conspiracy theories and things of this matter. But to theorize is human. Like we kind of like can't do without it. So for better or worse, right or wrong, theory is an important part of the human experience. And I hope that kind of that helps make this less intimidating, this endeavor that we're taking on here. Theory should not just be seen as like some rarefied realm of the expert, but as something that we all do and something that we all need. A theory of a method of understanding, of putting these facts together. There's also a good discussion going on here around knowledge and objectivity. How do we know what is the difference between like a social theory and a scientific theory? And similarly, I hadn't thought to emphasize this, like why read the original works, but it was very helpful for me to read through them. A lot of you do express some level of like intimidation about reading these texts, which I think is totally normal, and is something that, as I said on the first day of class, my primary objective as a teacher is to help make these texts more accessible to you, so that you can understand, what they're talking about. You can understand the historical context of the writings. And then lastly, I think most importantly, to understand why they're still relevant today, to understand why these ideas continue to be things that we're talking about in the 21st century, even though they're written 100 or more years ago. All right, so this question of why read the original works, I thought elicited a very interesting discussion around these texts. We talked a little bit last week about this question of order and action, and so how to navigate this. There was a good question that a couple of people have asked me about the terms rational and irrational. Let me see if I remember where exactly this was. Yeah, wait. Yeah. So people had been, I think, rightly a little confused about the question of rational versus non-rational. And the way that I kind of tried to weigh in on this was to remind us that when the authors are using these terms rational and non-rational, they're using them in the specific context of explaining motivations for actions. Why do people act in the way that they do in certain situations and with certain kinds of people? So I think that when you think about non-rational actions, it's important to think about whom or in what situation we would be more likely to act non-rationally. And that usually is like when we're with our family, our friends, our loved ones. Usually in those situations, we don't take on a kind of calculating, self-interested, logical kind of framework. We're usually coming from a place of emotion, of feeling, um, kind of empathetic connection. Those are the things that are more likely to spur us to non-rational actions, as opposed to in, like, say, the workplace or as a student, or in a court of law. Those are all situations where you would be wanting to be acting in a more rational way, in a more kind of like calculating way. So it's easy to get tripped up on these terms, rational and non-rational, because they can sound a little bit like there's some judgment behind them. And that's not necessarily the case here. Being non-rational does not necessarily mean like crazy or, not good. It means more that our behaviors are being motivated by different considerations. We might think of them as more of the considerations of the heart, or the feelings, um, as opposed to when we are motivated by rational action, it's more of a kind of a logical exercise of the mind, you know. Like, I don't know how many of you, if you've ever had this thing where you have an important life decision to make and you do like piece of paper and you do like pros on one side and cons on the other, you know, you kind of like make a list of like the risks and the rewards, or you think about like what's the most efficient way to accomplish goal X, whatever that goal is, make money or, get an A or get more followers on social media. If you're thinking in those terms, you're taking rational action. Now, rational action doesn't always mean like good, you know, like the Nazis took very rational action in like, killing as many people as they could in concentration camps. They were very calculating about it. They were very like emphasized efficiency, right? So rational action can have terrible consequences. Um, and so don't get tripped up on, you know, whether it rational or non-rational as being like some kind of like moral judgment, you know. They can both can have positive or negative consequences. So I saw that discussion kind of going on and wanted to kind of intervene in the discussion here. I hope that that kind of, you know, clarifies some things about what they mean by the difference between these things. There was a couple of other things I wanted to make sure to comment on. The questions of order and action. I wanted to make sure to comment on this questions of the Enlightenment. Because here, again, we had a very robust and interesting conversation about, again, a lot about these questions of science and religion, right? So the Enlightenment comes at a particular moment, and the scientific revolution comes at a particular moment before that, where the church has had basically a monopoly on knowledge. They've had, you know, they have basically monopolized. How do we know about people? How do we know about nature? All the knowledge is basically dictated by the church. And so the scientific revolution and then the Enlightenment kind of issue a challenge to that monopoly in a way that I suggested, and here's where the discussion got really robust, that we're kind of still fighting this fight, right? That this kind of like this question of science versus religion is not like over. That this continues to be like a very salient conflict over these questions of knowledge. And so the discussion here, if you haven't read it, I think is really worth kind of going into, because I think a lot of your fellow classmates had interesting perspectives on this. And it goes, you know, all the way into questions that we're continuing to have today around science, that go all the way into like, you know, say the COVID epidemic, or a lot of people brought up like questions around like abortion, right? And like whether abortion is kind of seen as like a moral issue or a medical practice, right? Which it is in most of the world, right? It is seen as like a medical procedure. But when it becomes weighted with this question of moral, you know, a moral question, then the politics of it change. Similarly, I think we're having a lot of this question today around like transgender care, right? And people like kind of being opposed to this, not so much on like scientific grounds, but on moral grounds, right? So again, hopefully this is where these questions that go back to like the 17th and 18th century are still relevant for us today. And we can recognize, you know, that like these issues that we're just debating as a society today and where there's these immense conflicts over are part of this longer lineage. You know, we just keep like kind of tracing them back and back and back and find that they have very, you know, they have centuries of baggage behind them. Right. I wanted to make sure to also comment on the discussion around industrialization. because this is going to be really important for Marx, right? Um, and it's important for all of the theorists that we look at this semester, but especially for Marx, because Marx is kind of like coming of age at the same time that industrial capitalism is really taking root in societies and changing the whole social order. So a lot of the discussion here was very robust around those changes in everyday life, the way that this kind of erases the older traditions and the sense of community and the sense of social order that had defined previous societies. And Marx will be especially interested in commenting on them. Jill had raised an important question that I felt compelled to respond to, also about increasing individualism as a result of the Industrial Revolution. That what happens with industrialization, in other words, is that communities are broken apart and old forms of social order are fragmented, and individuals gain more freedom in one sense, but also like dependence in another sense, like dependence on, for example, the job market. You know, now like we have to have a job in order to feed ourselves in a way that previous generations, you know, might have like grown their own food, right? So the individual is placed in a situation of like competition with other individuals. Marx will refer to this as a form of alienation, in which we are alienated not only from the products of our labor, but also from other human beings, right? And so the competition fragments our sense of community, our sense of social responsibility, our connection to other people. And so
Yeah.
it creates this kind of sink or swim mentality. Go ahead, Jill. Did you want to say something too?
Yeah, I was gonna just add, like, it's wild to me that, you know, through industrialization and then globalization, rather than creating this collective, you know, humanity, we've become more individualistic
Yeah,
because of it.
exactly.
How did we
Totally.
all come together to, you know, through I what I believe is capitalism? How did we come together and then just, you know, everyone's out for themselves?
Yeah. And so this will be Marx's kind of thing is that what we have to do is come together on an international global kind of scale. This is this whole thing where he says, you know, workers of the world unite, you know, like you have nothing to lose but your chains. In other words, that we have to recognize that we have collective interests together, and we need to develop a sense of solidarity, of understanding how our lives are interconnected with one another. You know, how our fate, our survival, you know, in this time of climate change, even that like our survival depends on our ability to act collectively. But Marx will say that pretty much everything in capitalism kind of mitigates against that. You know, it prevents us from realizing that because we're always being placed in these situations of competition. You know, we're always having to compete against other people, you know, to maximize our interests and to you know, to survive in this job market. And so modern society becomes increasingly individualistic, and the word I like is atomized, like an atom, ATOM, in physics, right? Like everybody kind of separated from one another, with no like organic connection. to their neighbors, to their fellow workers, to their fellow community members, etc. It's a real problem. So Marx will identify the problems with what he calls alienation in the context of this kind of competition, but it's a problem for all of the theorists that we look at. Durkheim worries that modern societies, as I commented to you here, Jill, like Durkheim is one who is especially concerned with how like social order, community, and tradition, how all those things break down as a result of the increasing individualism of society. And it's a kind of a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it's like, okay, well, individuals have more freedom, they have more autonomy, they have more choice, they can be, different, they can let their freak flag fly in all sorts of ways. But on the other hand, there's no sense of like a safety net or like a community. Like, who do you turn to when you have problems or you need help? Modern society kind of leaves us alone for better and for worse in this sense. So all of these theorists are wrestling with these ideas of individualism and social order. And I wanted to make sure that we emphasize that because it's something that we're going to look at throughout the whole semester. So a lot of this material on the Industrial Revolution is pertinent to that discussion, as are the questions about the French Revolution, which of course is built on the ideas of the Enlightenment. Yeah, so this chapter I thought was pretty good as far as like introducing us to these questions about the Enlightenment, and then the theorists that contributed to it, and then as we end up here with what they call the limits of the Enlightenment. And that, as I posed this question about, like, for example, scientific theories of race, and we note that, like at the same time that there was this Enlightenment, there was also like slavery and settler colonialism and all these things that directly contradicted the ideals of the Enlightenment. And so to this day, there is this question of like, do we dispense with the Enlightenment and forget about the Enlightenment? Or do we try to realize its ideas in a more perfect, kind of way? If we threw away the Enlightenment, would that be like throwing out the baby with the bathwater? Or is the Enlightenment just so contaminated by its historical baggage that we need to kind of like start all over again? This is a question I do not have a good answer for. This is a question you are free to formulate your own opinions or answers for, but I pose it as an open question rather than something that I can definitively say, like, I know what's best to do here. Right. So the limits of the Enlightenment is something also to kind of chew on the whole semester. To what extent are these ideas, like inherently corrupted by Eurocentrism, slavery, the legacy of colonization and imperialism, racism, and so forth. So, again, not a question that I can answer for you, but I think is absolutely crucial to ask. All right. Hold on one second. My light here in my office kind of keeps going in and out, so I'm going to try to fix the lighting situation. And if somebody has a question or last comment before we move on to Marx, I'd love to hear it. So just give me 1 second. Let's see. Okay. I think that's better. It's just like, I don't know, for whatever reason, like there's a kind of a shadow and a blinking effect that I've found personally distracting. I hope that's better. Okay, so any questions, comments, final thoughts before we move on to Marx? Okay. In summary, I thought this was a really good discussion, and I hope that I enjoyed reading your responses, and I hope it's one that the kind of discussion that we can continue to have all semester, particularly around how these things are still relevant for us today. So let's take a look at the readings from Marx. I'm very excited to teach you about Marx. Like I said, I think all of these theorists have something important to say, but I think Marx is especially crucial because he has so much to say about modern capitalism. So here, I think this is a good exercise. I'm really interested to hear what you all have to say about maybe your own job experiences after you've kind of read that. You know, did you have a job that left you feeling empty inside? Have you felt that you were just a number, even though you might do your job, that you might easily be replaced by another worker or a machine, or today, like by AI or something like this? You know, if so, then Marx might be the thinker for you. And so it starts here with these contemporary examples from the workplace. And you might feel that way, not even only at your job, but maybe as like a customer. You like call up those call centers and they're like, oh, your call is very important to us, and you're like, no, it's not. Anywhere where you're kind of treated like a number or a thing rather than a human being. So that might be, in line at the DMV, or, dealing with your health insurance company, or, even as a student in these immense bureaucracies. We all at some point become like thingified or objectified in the sense of being made into an object, rather than a person. And so these are the kinds of experiences that Marx is trying to kind of theorize. So this is what this long um, uh, sort of introduction here is kind of getting at. And the way that I've posed it as a question for you to ponder is like, the first thing that probably everybody says about Karl Marx, the thing that they know or that they think they know, is that Marx was like the father of communism, right? This was like, he was the father of modern socialism or modern communism, and that this is what he's kind of famous for. But the fact of the matter is that Marx spent um, almost his entire life writing about capitalism, about the system that we live under today. What he had to say about communism was honestly kind of vague, kind of like dreamy, dreamy in the sense of like he's envisioning a world that didn't exist, right? So he's like speculating when he writes about communism. But he spent most of his life writing thousands and thousands and thousands of pages about what makes capitalism work, because he could see the Industrial Revolution and the effects of industrialization in his own time. right? This provided him with data and evidence and, all kinds of this stuff. Uh, and so the so this is like Marx's like kind of starting point. So he seeks to explain these kinds of things. And the question that I've posed for you after reading through this introduction and then of watching the film is like whether you agree that Marx's ideas are as relevant today as they were more than a century ago. That's the way it puts it at the end of this passage, because the fact of the matter is that we live in the most capitalist society in the history of the world. Marx's ideas about communism, or his kind of like vision of communism, didn't really like work out the way that he had planned it, or the way he had kind of like envisioned it. I wouldn't say he planned it, because he didn't really have a plan. It was more of an inkling, an idea, an imagination. But his ideas about capitalism, his critique of capitalism, his analysis of capitalism, I would say has many things that are even more true today than they were in his time. And so those are the kinds of dynamics that I'm hoping that you'll pick up on over the next few weeks. So this biographical sketch kind of tells you about Marx's history, where he kind of comes from. Marx basically starts off as a philosopher. He's interested in these big ideas about existence and God and religion and all these big questions that the philosophers were kind of concerned with. But then he's kind of shaped to go in a new direction because of the events that are happening around him. The events that are happening around him, as I mentioned, are like industrialization and the growth of industrial capitalism, but they're also like the workers fighting back against industrialization. Go ahead, Fernando.
I had put it in a comment, but it's a really silly question. I personally don't understand capitalism. I don't know what it is. Is
Yeah.
there a way you can briefly explain what capitalism is? Because I feel like I'd have to understand these different, well, this jargon before I even try to understand who Marx is. So if I'd appreciate it if you can explain.
That's a great question, and hopefully it'll become kind of more apparent as you digest the film and this reading. It's not something I can answer for you in a real like succinct textbook. Webster's defines capitalism as blah blah blah. We can first of all we can say that a capitalist society is a society in which the institutions are kind of decided by the pursuit of profit, right? So it's motivated not by what human beings need per se, but by monetary profits that will be earned by private entities, so businesses, corporations, and so forth. Capitalist society is one in which society is divided between those who own those, what Marx calls the means of production, right? So those who own the corporations and the companies and the private firms, and the vast majority of people who have to work for them in order to earn a living. You may remember, actually, many of you are probably too young to remember, but during the Occupy Wall Street movement, they talked about the 1% and the 99%. The 1% being those who own, most of the wealth and are getting richer and richer and richer over time, and the 99% of people who have to work for a living, who have to sell their, Marx calls it their labor power, basically their ability to work in exchange for a wage that they then, use to pay their rent and their bills and so forth. And the idea is that the 99%, while the 1% are getting richer, the 99% are having struggling to keep up, right? So we have this expanding inequality in society that Marx thinks is like a feature and not a bug of capitalism. In other words, it's built into capitalism to have this system creating more inequality. It doesn't mean the system is broken. On the contrary, it means that capitalism is like a rigged system, like a game that is fixed to enrich a small elite at the expense of a working majority. And it's basically saying that like that rich elite is getting rich precisely because they are exploiting the work, the labor power of those of that working majority. So those are the kind of the basic elements of a capitalist society, the foundation of inequality that society is built upon. Now, as we will look into this further, you could kind of think of like capitalism as like say a tree, where the roots of that tree are exploitation, and particularly the exploitation of workers. And then on the all the different, there's all these kind of branches and leaves and these things that grow out of those roots that we will call a capitalist society. So the legal system, the media, the culture, all of these things grow out of the roots of exploitation. So that's why it's hard for me to answer just like in this kind of way, because I can tell you about the roots, but we're going to have to kind of learn about the branches and the leaves and all the the other aspects of the tree as we kind of go along. I hope that kind of like starts to answer your question. I know
Oh,
it can't possibly.
that's perfect for now. That's totally perfect for now.
Great. That's great to hear. Thank you, Fernando, and thank you for asking that,
Oh,
because
thank you, Professor.
it's something that like I kind of sometimes take for granted. I'm like, oh, we're living under capitalism, like, and then like, oh wait, we have to do like a quick little explainer about what that means. So I'm sure if you were thinking it, there are other people in the class that were thinking the same way.
Yeah, and it goes back to what you mentioned earlier about how intimidating these readings are, and they are, especially since, well, I haven't touched a sociology class in the past 2 years, so I'm forgetting all of this, and it's like fresh. So
Yeah,
it's something that I have to relearn, and especially following theorists, not necessarily as complicated, but as detailed as the ones that we're going to be studying. I just feel like I have to get a good grasp of the nitty gritty and the small fundamentals before getting deeper into what we're actually supposed to be learning.
totally. I imagine that your experience mirrors those of the other students in the class. And so what I would say is it's going to be really helpful to read, I think, these introductions before you actually tackle the texts themselves. to kind of read these overviews of their key concepts and influences and ideas, right? And hopefully, like my explanations for things will help too. And then to also remember that there's no such thing as like a dumb question, right? So like that we're all kind of everybody's kind of figuring this stuff out together, and sometimes there will be points where I unintentionally take it for granted that people know what I'm talking about, and so it's like helpful to have those kinds of questions to interject and kind of take me back to have to explain some things. Yeah. So yeah, like those and just don't beat yourself up for not getting it the first time. You know what I mean? Like this is hard. It's not like a lot of reading in terms of like the number of pages, but it's like demanding stuff, and it's abstract, it's big ideas. And so it's like, yeah, I appreciate your persistence and your perseverance in trying to wrestle with these things, And so just to remember that it's like it's difficult. It is. Um, and so that's also kind of like partly what I'm here for. Um, so here's another kind of thing that I try to do, which is to give you some historical context. So again, this thing that like where most people know Marx as like the father of communism or socialism or whatever, um, is kind of not accurate. So part of the historical context that is given here um, is it's important to realize that this thing called socialism existed before Marx. So in this idea, he kind of inherited this idea. Now, he put a unique spin on it. He didn't just like plagiarize the idea and call it his own. He was like, okay, yeah, there's these people like this guy Saint Simon that's mentioned in this paragraph is a French philosopher who came before Marx, and he had this idea of socialism as a kind of like a going back to the land, getting away from these congested, polluted cities, and people could go live on a cooperative farm and work together in this kind of cooperative socialistic kind of way where you know all the property was commonly owned and people worked for the benefit of one another. Saint Simon had this idea before Marx was even born. But the difference is that Marx comes along and says the only way we're going to get there is through class struggle. It's going to have to be the working classes organizing, demonstrating, going on strike, and ultimately having a revolution. That's the only way we're going to get to this socialist utopia. It's the only way that we're going to get out of the problems of capitalism and move into a better socialist society. Whereas Saint Simon was kind of like we want to kind of escape and move away from like these congested cities with these polluting factories, and we want to go back to the land. Saint Simon was like hippies in the 1960s who wanted to create like these communes, like in Marin County and these places where they went back to the land and tried to create these cooperatives, not by like confronting the capitalist system, but kind of like trying to escape it. And Marx would be like, would wag his finger and say like, no, there is no voluntary escape. We must confront this system because Marx believes as we will see when we read the Communist Manifesto, Marx believes that class struggle is the thing that is the only thing really that has changed history, that has been the motor force, the engine of history has been struggle. Struggle between the oppressor and the oppressed is the thing that has caused history to change and develop and move. Frederick Douglass, the former American slave, said something different, similar, when he said, without struggle there is no progress, right? So this is the idea of Marx and what separates him from these socialists that came before. Also, to give you some context, Marx is in developing his critique of capitalism, he is wrestling with the most important theorists who today we would call them economists. Back in the day, in this time, they were referred to as political economy. And those are the people like Adam Smith and David Ricardo. You've probably heard of Adam Smith at the very least. Adam Smith is still a champion of free market economics. The idea of supply and demand, and the idea of that capitalism has this kind of like equilibrium, and if we just kind of leave people to pursue their self-interests, that this will work out for the common good. Adam Smith talks about the invisible hand of the marketplace, which is a thing that economists to this day sort of trot out. So Marx took these people's ideas very seriously at the same time that he disagreed with them. And his analysis is founded on his critical interpretation, like a reinterpretation of what Smith and Ricardo were up to. So he is kind of reading against the grain. He's reading these people, taking them very seriously, but coming to alternative conclusions and sort of reading them beyond their own limitations as Marx saw them. So this is why I highlight this passage in the reading, is to emphasize the role that they played in terms of developing Marx's analysis and his critique of political economy in this critical way. Another historical influence that I have talked about or highlighted for you here is the revolutionary context of 1848. Now, in 1848, we see a series of uprisings among working people, among peasants, among poor people, unemployed, people who are rising up against their governments in Europe. And so the 1848 revolutions, they kind of begin in France, and then they go to Germany, and they kind of spread like wildfire across Europe during the spring of 1848. It's kind of similar to like what we saw with the Arab Spring in 2011. Revolutions are like contagious. They move from one place to another. It starts in one place, and then people in the next place are like, oh, maybe we should do that too. Maybe, we can fight for our rights and fight for equality and justice. And we're kind of like inspired by what these, people are doing. So that, the Arab Spring started in Tunisia, and then went, to Egypt. And just the idea here is that revolutions are contagious in this sort of way. So in 1848, this revolution was spreading, And Marx and Engels were like, oh, we want to be part of this. So they, as it says here, they leave Brussels. Marx is already at this point, he's been kicked out of Paris, and he's had to move to Belgium, to Brussels. So then Marx and Engels, when the revolution starts, they go to Cologne in the industrial part of Germany. They start up this revolutionary newspaper. They're really throwing themselves into the possibility of this kind of change. And this gets Marx into a lot of trouble. He and his wife are briefly arrested. They're charged with inciting rebellion. There are thousands of other people like them who are charged with inciting rebellion. So there's this whole wave of repression that by the government and by the monarchy, the old aristocracy, that kind of comes down like a hammer on these revolutionaries, and forces them into the courts and in many cases into prison. So Marx is one of the lucky ones in the sense that he was acquitted, but still nonetheless forced to leave the country. And so he goes back to Paris for a brief minute, but then the French government, pressures him, out also. He's this kind of this man who's basically got a target on his head because of his revolutionary ideas. And so he, has nowhere to go. And so in the end, he goes to basically the one place that'll take him, which is Britain. And so he goes to London in 1849 and then spends the rest of his life in London, basically studying political economy, studying Ricardo and Smith and these kind of economic theories. So these events have an important influence on Marx personally because they kind of show the ugly face of this government repression, and he and his fellow revolutionaries are really persecuted for their beliefs and forced into exile. They're basically forced to become refugees. So that is something that kind of sharpens that experience, sharpens his critical perspective on the world around him. So these are, I think, all important influences to keep in mind in terms of how Marx got to be the way that he is. Just gonna, oh, that was your question earlier. Okay. The key aspect of Marx's critique will be of industrial society. And the place where this was really popping off more than anywhere in the world was in Manchester, England. This was a city where a lot of industrial factories were created, especially for creating, like textiles, like shirts and clothing and that sort of thing. A lot of which was manufactured with cotton that had been imported from the American South, that had been picked by cotton that had been picked by enslaved workers in the South, and then was exported to places like Manchester to make clothing and textiles and shirts and bedding and all this kind of thing. So in the first half of the 19th century, Manchester is the place where you can see the worst consequences of industrialization. You have this exploding population. You have people that are forced to live in this substandard housing, a lot of times that doesn't have heat or light, that don't have sanitary conditions, and so disease is spreading rampantly. And then in the factories themselves are poorly ventilated, not well lit, frequently very dangerous. People are working like 70 hours a week in these factories. And a lot of times it's child labor that, children are working in these factories. So this is, another philosopher named John Stuart Mill referred to these as the satanic mills of industry, that these were like literally like hell holes, right? Of human existence, and exploitation of workers. So as it says at the end of the paragraph, hell on earth. You'll see in the documentary they talk about this about child labor in like the coal mines, right? So like coal is what's being extracted in order to provide the energy for the Industrial Revolution. And the consequence of that is you have, children that are working in these coal pits, in part because they're smaller and they can kind of maneuver in these spaces. But people are getting, these diseases that are killing them, like when they're like 18 years old. The life expectancy in Manchester was like people didn't live into their like, the people routinely died in their 20s. So it was a real it was truly hell on earth. And so it's by seeing the worst of these aspects of industrialization that Marx and Engels are inspired to write their critical theory, because they have seen the worst of these. In Engels, he has a direct connection. Engels was the son of one of these factory owners. So Engels was like a very privileged kid, whose dad ran one of these factories, and Engels was horrified by what he saw, horrified by the way that people in Manchester, the working classes, were forced to live. And so it got into this huge series of fights with his father, and kind of like joined up with Karl Marx, into this kind of critical enterprise. Engels, as a young man, wrote this book called "The Condition of the Working Class in England," that drew on like what he was seeing in Manchester, in people like his family's textile mill. And so this crystallizes their idea that the working class has to be the agent of revolutionary change. That the working class, the exploited, oppressed, degraded peoples of the world have to come together in order to change this system. So Marx's ideas, kind of will go from being like more abstractly philosophical to being focused on these questions of economics, because he believes that economics will be the key to human liberation, to emancipation, to true freedom. That people cannot be free and cannot be liberated if they have to work in these kind of factories and these, in these cities that are hell on earth, right? So these are the larger historical and social circumstances that will shape the ideas that we're going to be looking at, in the weeks to come. So I've highlighted, here you see some of the, pictures of like child factory, child labor. This is actually a young woman, a young girl, working in a textile mill in the United States. They talk about how these kinds of conditions are still things that you can see like in China today, like how our iPhones are made, are not unsimilar situations to what you see in a place like Manchester. So again, I've highlighted a lot of these ideas. We can kind of come back to them on the next class. And then we'll eventually hop into a close reading of this text called The German Ideology. So next class, we'll kind of pick up from, continuing to introduce Marx's core ideas and influences. And then we'll look at this text called The German Ideology. And that'll be the first text that we really do a Bible study style close reading of. Do I have any questions, parting questions, comments, concerns, or confusions from anyone who is present here today?
I got a question, and it goes back to the quizzes again.
Okay, go for it.
How much of this information do we have to know? Because it's a lot of history, it's a lot of ideas. Like, I mean, I can kind of see where you'd have to pick and choose the important pieces.
Yeah.
Like German ideology is pretty important, and like understanding capitalism, socialism, very important for Karl. So I just want to, see how many personal notes I'd have to take for myself, and how much I should actually soak up.
My not very helpful answer is to try to soak it all up.
All right.
My more practical answer is that when the quizzes come around, this is why I don't structure them like pop quizzes and more like take-home tests that you have a week to complete. So for those kinds of things in a more practical sense, you can kind of open up those quizzes, look at the questions, and be like, oh, this is what I need to know, And so those quizzes couldn't possibly cover everything, right?
Right.
So as a teacher, I want you to learn it all and then some.
Right.
As somebody who is more practically minded and realistic, I've structured the quizzes in this kind of way, that again is more like an open book test. I try as a teacher to repeat things. I hope it doesn't make me seem too redundant, but I do have like a philosophy that like, oh, this nobody learns anything if I only say it once.
Right.
Right. So like I feel like I'm constantly repeating things that I think are really important. So if you hear me say something more than once, you're like, oh yeah, it'd be good to learn that sort of thing. Let's see if I have another shot. Yeah, so Linda, these are things that are open book in the sense that like you can just open up these quizzes and you have a full week to complete them. So, you can use all the materials at your disposal to answer the questions. Hope that addresses that. Okay, yeah. Okay, I'm going to stop the share and thank you again to those of you who are here. I'm just making sure that I've got all your names. Sam, Tamayo. Okay, Empress, you're here. Great. Thanks again to all of you who are here, and I'll see you next time. I hope you have a good day. Bye.